Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Yep, happy Thursday. Get my day right. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our webinar today, so a student submitted work generated by AI. Now what? I'll let a few folks continue to enter the webinar. And as you are signing in, please open up the chat and introduce yourself, name, where you're coming from, maybe if you're coming from Pima Community College, or if you're coming from a K-12 school, let us know where you're coming from. And then if you are an educator, what you teach, or what is bringing you to this webinar today. So I will go ahead and get started by doing some introductions. My name is Kelsey Behringer. I am the COO here at Packback. I started my professional career in the K-12 classroom teaching high school chemistry, which was always an uphill battle, but a fun one to fight nevertheless. I joined the Packback team as an implementation specialist, helping instructors implement Packback into their course to make sure that we were achieving the goals set out by the instructor, and then most recently moved into this role in November. So happy to be here today and surrounded by wonderful educators, Bryan McCarthy and Reed Dickson. So I'm going to go ahead and let Bryan, you introduce yourself to the webinar.
Hi, I'm Bryan. I teach philosophy, and you can see some of the kind of bio information on the screen there. Obviously, my facial hair situation has changed since this picture. I work on, as it says, the relationship between religion and clothing, but more broadly, the relationship between religion and stuff, I guess you could say, and the way that stuff helps people be more spiritual or more religious, and that leads out into all sorts of different areas. For example, I recently read something on the use of psychedelics for religious edification. So it's kind of anything that's in sort of the furniture of our lives that augments spirituality in those kinds of ways.
Thanks so much. And Bryan, your Packback representative, Krista, is in the chat and says hello. So happy to be here. And then Reed, introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Reed Dickson. I'm the program manager at Pima Community College for faculty development, and I write about ed tech and online teaching. I teach at my college ed tech and online pedagogy courses, but I also teach like creative nonfiction and composition, and previously came out as I was a K-12 teacher, directed a teacher education program at Teachers College at Columbia University, and have a background in STEM ed as well. Used to teach math as well, believe it or not. So I'm all over the place. And I love seeing people from Pima Community College in the chat feed. I just see James Sheldon coming through. It's great to be with you all this morning as we take a deep dive in and have a frank conversation about all this.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining as panelists today. I'm really excited for the conversation. I'll lay out a rough agenda here. What we want to talk about here is how AI detection works, and just I had our CTO, Craig Booth, give me an overview. I'm not a computer science major, but I'll do my best here to break it down into human terms. But what we want to talk about today is what happens after detection, because this is, an unprecedented time, if you will. These are it's a brand new experience for us. We're all learning as we're going. And this is definitely a time for instructors to communicate with one another, ask questions, and learn through experiences, and basically just be very open throughout this entire learning process. So we'll talk about how to basically look for signs of AI detection outside of just by using detectors. We'll talk about how to intervene and have discussions with students, and then also how to just prevent misuse of generative AI, not necessarily use, but misuse. So I already warned Bryan and Reed, I'm going to talk for a little bit at the beginning, and then we're going to open up for a lofty, amazing, candid conversation from Reed and Bryan. But I want to start first by briefly touching on how AI generated text detectors work. And the way that I'm going to explain that is by first reminding everyone how plagiarism detectors work. So we are all of these, all of the panelists here and hosts are familiar with plagiarism. I'm familiar with plagiarism as an educator. It's something that we've been dealing with for years, whether it is students copying and pasting from an outside source or asking their friend to write something for us. It's not new. And like kind of this generic historical plagiarism detection is relatively easy to prove. There is what I like to call forensic evidence. What these detectors are doing is looking at a database of text and they're finding matches. And maybe there'll be a slight modification, but we can deliver kind of this report that says this was the database text, this was the submitted text match. Now, AI generated text detectors are not looking at a database. It's not like, you know, GPT-0 is looking at all posts that have ever been submitted by ChatGPT and looking at that database and cross-referencing. That's not happening. So what you have with plagiarism detection is what I like to call like forensic evidence. It's solid, it's there, it's provable. AI detection is very circumstantial. So AI text detectors are simply statistical models. It is predicting the most likely word in a series of words. So what AI text detectors do is just use that model in reverse, right? It's very easy to use a statistical model on a statistical model. So what AI detectors are doing is things like predicting how closely does the submitted text align with what a machine would have written, which, by the way, some students just write really generically, especially if they're using, you know, grammar checkers. So here's a potential gray area, but they're also looking at things like randomness. So as we've probably all experienced with generative AI like ChatGPT, sometimes it could be very generic. It lacks, you know, anecdotes, personal experience, it's repetitive. So what a lot of AI text detectors are doing are looking for signs of randomness. They're looking for spelling errors. They're looking for random use of personal anecdotes or words, anything really specific. A great example is, you know, Brian, if something happened inside of your class, you made a funny joke and I referenced that in my paper, it's very unlikely ChatGPT is going to reference that, you know, funny thing that you said in class. So it's a great sign of randomness. This is how AI text detection works. So if it isn't obvious already, it's a hard thing to just definitively prove. It is different from plagiarism detection in that way. So that's why this conversation is so important to have and why we need to start having these conversations, regardless if you're in K-12 or higher education, is we cannot be unprepared for these student conversations that are going to happen this semester and beyond. I want to just briefly touch on AI generated text detection with Packback, because at the end of the day, I do work at Packback, and we are really happy to have implemented AI text detection in both our discussion platform, Packback Questions, and our writing platform, our long form writing platform, Packback Deep Dives. So basically what's happening is every single post that is submitted in our discussion platform and every assignment that's submitted in our essay platform, Deep Dives, is automatically being checked for AI detection. This was added in early 2023, around January. And with questions, students will be moderated and be given the option to edit and resubmit their post for full credit. Now on Deep Dives, it's a little bit different in that once a student submits, we run the detectors and we actually will bring an originality report to the instructor in the grading experience. But one thing I do want to make very clear is that detection is not what wakes me up every single morning. Detection is not what I will stake my reputation on. And at Packback, what our mission is to do is to give students such robust feedback in their writing process that detection is it's not even a thing we care about, because students are given so much feedback that we can prevent the plagiarism from happening. So what's happening on Packback is that before students submit, they are given feedback on things like their grammar. On Deep Dives, they're given feedback on the credibility of their sources. And in questions, they're given a risk of their submission being flagged in the future. So it's really important as we're talking about AI to differentiate between generative AI that might be giving the fish to students and instructional AI that is teaching students to fish, which is what wakes me up in the morning. It's why I show up to work when it's torrentially downpouring in Chicago this morning. So some AI generated text detectors you may have heard of. GPT-0 has been quite a phenomenon. You have this Princeton student, I think a senior, who created an AI text detector. OpenAI just launched their own AI text detector. I've heard of Writer and CopyLeaks. I'm sure there are more, and a small very hush announcement is that the detector that is working in the background of Packback will be publicly available, free to use on 2/15 with something called ChatGPT by Packback Labs. So if you're curious to hear more about that, I can give you all the deets in exactly 6 days. But until then, we've got to keep it under wraps. So I'm now going to stop talking and let our amazing panelists start sharing their insight and engaging in a lively discussion. And the first thing we want to talk about is what happens when either you are suspicious of submitted text or you've actually detected AI plagiarism via detector. So one question I have for the panelists, and we're going to start with Bryan because Bryan has a really great story from this term, is basically what red flags have you encountered thus far that have raised kind of these AI submission suspicions? So Bryan, if you could tell us a little bit about your story.
Yes, I can. Thank you, Kelsey. So first of all, I had a bit of a baseline assignment for my students this term. So it's before I've taught them anything. And I'm just trying to, because I teach philosophy, I'm trying to get to see what they believe about certain philosophical topics. It's sort of like a philosophy version of what's your favorite color kind of paper. And they just say what they believe about a question and why. And that gives me, number one, the opportunity to hear from them before they have to impress me. And number two, it gives them the opportunity to see what they already think about something before we've actually started talking about it. And then whenever they go back and look at that later, it allows them to see how their views have evolved based on the material and not just me. So so this was and I'll talk, I think there's another question Kelsey's going to ask about like how we sort of prevent people from even being wanting to plagiarize. And I have some thoughts about that based on this assignment, but it was a very low stakes kind of assignment. They weren't asked to know very much or anything like that. It's just kind of give me your opinion. And there were at least 2 of the 50 students who cheated on this, who used ChatGPT in what we're calling a misuse case. And the way that ChatGPT works is that it spits out a very kind of irregular sort of format. It always starts by, if you ask it a question, it'll say, "This is a very complicated topic," which, it's philosophy, I know. So it's a very complicated topic. Some philosophers believe this, some philosophers believe that, or might just say some believe this, others believe that. Some argue this, others argue that. And then it'll kind of finish it off by saying overall, usually it's overall, sometimes it says in the end or something like that. It's a very complicated topic, probably be debated for centuries, etc. Okay, so that's the basic format. It's a complicated topic. Some say this, others say this, some say this, others say this. It's a very complicated topic and will probably be debated for centuries. Sounds like actually a bad undergraduate paper. Now, in my case, there is no thing that I'm asking them that would ask them to say, some say, others say, some say, others say. It's a very complicated topic. That format is just not something that they need for my class. So if I see a paper where I'm asking them to argue for a position or something like that, this some say, others say thing won't really look like what they're doing if they do the assignment correctly. So that's a big red flag. The other thing is that I actually ran my own questions through ChatGPT myself. And I ran it through a couple of times, and there was, like sentences here and there that showed up almost verbatim in their papers. Now, the thing is that ChatGPT will give you slightly different phrasing of those lines and paragraphs depending on what you put in. So if I put in, write me a philosophy paper about this question, and then I lay my question down, I get a slightly different answer than if I just say, what's the answer to this question? So, because now it's trying to be philosophical or whatever. But I tried a few different versions and I could see these sentences. Sometimes a clause would be missing, but it's the same basic sentence or 2 sentences. And so when I see that pretty much identical text, then I'm thinking something's wrong. Now, one issue with this is that both of the ones who did it for me ran it through a paraphrasing software after they got it from ChatGPT. And what that means is that it's going to go in there and say, it'll take a sentence like, if you let me borrow your car, I'll pick you up dinner on the way home. And it'll change it around and say, I'll pick you up dinner on the way home if you let me borrow your car. And then it'll change car to automobile, and it'll change dinner to meal. And so you'll have a sentence like that. And what that does that's annoying is that it prevents these detectors from finding out that anything has happened, because if it's looking for the most likely word after the string of words that it's already got, and they threw in another one, then it thinks it can't catch it. Okay, so that's frustrating. The other thing that it does, though, that's in our favor is that it can't do technical terms. A favorite example of a political scientist colleague of mine is that it'll put like, it can't find a synonym for citizen because there isn't one. It's a very like special term, like, and so it'll try to say like, inhabitant or something like that, but that's not what we mean when we talk about citizen. There's not really a good synonym for that. And in my case, what happened is, in philosophy, there's something called the problem of evil, which is basically, why do bad things happen to good people? If there's a God, that kind of stuff. It's called the problem of evil. You could call it theodicy for the whole problem of evil, but these paraphrasers are not that sophisticated. And so she kind of got that information from the chatbot, because it was like, these are some of the arguments against God's existence, and it kind of brought up this thing. But when she ran it through the paraphraser, it changed the word problem to the word trouble, because of course that is a kind of synonym for problem, trouble. But there is no trouble of evil. You have to change the whole phrase to theodicy if you want another technical term for it. If it just says trouble of evil, I know something's gone wrong. So technical terms do not, if they combine these two things, ChatGPT with the Quillbot, which will throw everybody's detectors, it'll think the paper's fine. But you can look for like problems with technical terms.
I think that's a great point, is you have to look out for the weird inaccuracies, because you're the content expert, and that's what you have in your favor, is that you're going to be able to say, it's not trouble of evil. That's not what this term is in the text, in the discussions and everything. It's been, whatever the phrase is, problem of evil. We've talked about it multiple times. I should remember it by now. Bad student. Reed,
Kelsey,
anything to add?
Yeah, just you mentioned the weird inaccuracies, and also I think it's important to look for the weird consistencies. I've heard stories from folks who have seen 5 to 10 papers written at an institution, and they're all basically the same structure, paragraph by paragraph, but the words are entirely different as you proceed. And so you see a striking similarity between student work, even though they've clearly been used they've been using Quillbot, or they've been using some kind of, as Bryan said, a paraphrasing tool or an AI writing tool to just make it look slightly different, or rephrasing it in their own terms. Going back to the problem of the tool itself as well, it can get facts incredibly right and incredibly wrong. So I was speaking with someone who was wanting to learn about DACA student experience, and you can learn all the latest policy and state law from Arizona using the tool, but it will also give false information. Like if a student wants to know where they can get in-state tuition, it suggests California. But if you look closer at that, California actually doesn't work unless you've graduated from a California high school. So someone from Arizona could move to California to get in-state tuition. Those kind of nuances, we'll see little tiny facts that might be wrong, but it's still, I think, really hard to know with any certainty what tools have been used and if tools have been used inappropriately.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more importantly, or not more importantly, but more annoyingly, even if you can know, you cannot prove.
Yes, which is honestly going to be a great segue for our next question. But one thing I did want to share is this was some thoughts we had on the Packback side of things about like, okay, let's say you use a detector and it's saying high risk, or let's say your spidey senses are tingling. How do you verify your kind of spidey sense, if you will, or how do you verify a detector and score it at the end of the day? If the student failed the assignment because the assignment was poor, I think they're going to learn that it's not going to work to use maybe a software like this in your course, but check the sources. A lot of times generative AI either will make up a source, it's gotten better at that, but oftentimes it'll cite sources that are like not quite relevant to the topic. They just happen to be relevant in keyword.
We know that it's happening. I was speaking with my daughter this morning on the way to school, and she said she's a high school student. Every one of her teachers has found students using ChatGPT or other tools, and they're using AI detection. It's actually very helpful to know, or at least to suspect whether it's being used in your school. And in terms of the data, study.com had a survey showing that 89% of the 100 or 1,000 students that they surveyed, half were using it on tests or quizzes, many of them, I have to get the statistics accurate, but if you Google it, the study.com research shows that 89% of students used it on homework and 48 on a test or quiz. Stanford had a survey similarly saying that 17% of their students use the tool to respond. So while it may be hard for us to know absolutely, as Bryan notes, we know that it's being used. And these tools can really help us get a better sense, as Kelsey said, of knowing your spidey sense, at least get a better sense that you might be right when reality is we don't know for sure. And as the playground moral value of pointing one finger means pointing three fingers back at yourself, we have to be careful when we're judging students that maybe we're also doing something that is problematic in our own practice. When I find students cheating of any kind, I immediately blame myself first rather than blame my students, even though they might be cheating. What are the implications of cheating for us as educators is a difficult question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. I know we had talked about that a little because I felt kind of the same way of, when I catch a student, let's say in K-12, it was like leaning over and looking at their friend's paper. Am I upset because they're trying to get away with something? And is that an ego hit for me? Or am I upset because I really want the student to learn something from my course and I feel like they're not having a positive learning experience? So let's talk about, if you can go to the next slide, Lane, thank you so much. Let's talk about, once it's clear an assignment can be successfully gamed by AI, how can we update our assignments to perhaps either, I would say, prevent students from getting away with misuse, which is fine, but also like, how do we make them not want to, use ChatGPT for an assignment? So Bryan, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about what you told your students before this assignment in kind of a way to get them to use their authentic voice.
Yes, I wouldn't mind. Thank you, Kelsey. I created for this assignment, this was because it was before I would teach them anything, and I told them it would be used as the basis for a later assignment. And I specifically told them that it would not be created for content, and that they were not to do any research at all, that because I didn't, what was important about the assignment was not what they can find out about the assignment, but what they think about the different things that are in the assignment. And I even told them in class that I get a certain amount of joy out of getting to hear what they think before they have to worry about content. And so I think that probably prevented a lot of students from even thinking they would need it for this. Now, it's not foolproof because, of course, at least two definitely did use it. But I think probably there are some who were like, well, it's just asking me for my opinion, so I don't really need that for this. And they might have used it on another assignment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Something that I think one of our team members, Annie Jones, if you work with Annie Jones, shared was, always restating the purpose and the intention of an assignment and how it is ultimately going to serve the student experience. It sounds so silly to do, but in K-12 teaching, we have this thing called explain the why. Is constantly explain the why. And I think sometimes we forget that we still have to explain the why to our students to give them meaning. And in this case, 2 out of, I think 50, that seems like a win, considering what over 90% of students have used ChatGPT at one point. And I honestly think that's what you can credit it to. Reed, I know you had some thoughts on this question. So if you want to share, what you're thinking about when it comes to assignment modification.
I just want to say again that I love the fact that you're a K-12 teacher and that you bring that into Packback. explaining the why is huge, and how we are expecting our students to use AI in ways that are transparent is something that I'm trying to advocate for, which is transparent teaching and transparent learning practices. In other words, as educators, are we hyper transparent about our expectations on how AI can be used within the classroom? Are we hyper transparent about the college policies? And you may have very clear departmental or academic integrity policies that are stringent, and you need to follow those, but they're often limited to, are you doing false representations of your work? Are you representing the work of another person or somebody else's as your own? And if you create a space for students where you're clarifying, and they're able to clarify what tools they're using as part of their process, just like we expect students to cite sources, we expect them to cite tools now. And I believe it's either the journal Nature or the journal Science that is expecting researchers to do the same. They're not saying don't use these tools. They're saying be transparent about how you're using these tools. It helps us as educators learn how they're using AI as a learning aid, and helps us think about not just, are they cheating an assignment or how are they utilizing a tool, but what tools are they using to help their learning? It helps us get a feedback loop. It's a formative assessment loop. So transparent teaching and learning also means putting it in the syllabi, but it maybe having a separate page right when you are in your online class that explains how the tool can be used, or something in your first day introductions that explains, your practices transparently on assessment and on how AI should be used. And then the other point, this is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. To me, we get to rethink why we teach, why we learn, why we teach the subjects we teach, why I teach writing is in question. I think I'm realizing we overuse writing as a form of assessment. There's got to be many other kinds of project-based learning and digital learning artifacts we can use to assess our learners. But if we're using writing even still, or whatever the subject is, we can promote transparent learning practices. In other words, metacognitive practices in which students pause and reflect on what they're using, describe each step of their learning. When Wolfram Alpha came out, suddenly math education had to pivot 10 years ago and do the same thing, where they're explaining their processes as they go through each step. And the goal is, and now we're assessing process, not just the final score. And in writing, we do that as well. K-12 is very used to process-based first draft, second draft, final draft for their projects. And that's a question we got to consider more and more, is how do we support students in being transparent about their learning processes, so that we are not educator as police, but we're educator as mentor. We're supporting them in their process.
Absolutely. I love the concept too of like the documentation of process. One of my favorite assignments in grad school was, go do a lesson using this specific approach and then document, like basically almost minute by minute, if not every 5 minutes, what that was like for you. Reflect on the process. When you made this decision, why did you make it? It was my favorite assignment to write, because all I was doing was reflecting on what I did, the decisions I made, why I made them. And it was all me. It was authentic. I didn't feel pressure to, like Bryan, you said, impress. I was writing because I wanted to write about something. I was passionate about it. And I think that's, whenever I have conversations about how we change our assignments to be GPT proof, it's not even about making it GPT proof. It's about making assignments so fun and engaging to do. Why wouldn't I do the assignment?
And Kelsey, you mentioned that phrase that a lot of people are asking, like, how do we make an assignment GPT proof? It's a very, very difficult question, but one thing that it's an opportunity for is to say, well, how do we do assignments in which students have to reflect on their writing or build upon their own funds of knowledge in the assignment or their local communities in ways that the AI can't really fake as easily. In other words, if we're asking students to think about their college career, community goals, their personal connections with content, they're going to want, and as part of their personal academic identity, to just write authentically in those pieces. And it's harder for AI to hack those. And then Bryan, I think you mentioned the idea of having folks interview their peers as an authentic activity. If I'm remembering correctly, the idea of having activities which students maybe are recording themselves or doing something in a live classroom where they're able to demonstrate their knowledge in another way besides the traditional high stakes paper or project.
Absolutely.
Bryan, do you want to share more about that idea?
Yeah, I was, if you're referring to what I think you're referring to is like in one of our kind of like pre-calls or something where I had said that I had specifically in mind Socrates, where they have this dialogical thing where Socrates is talking to somebody else and they're kind of investigating each other's ideas. And I thought it might be interesting to see if you got two students together and I don't know, maybe I assign them Socrates, or something first, and then I say, hey, Plato, and then have them say something like, well, you know, like now, here's a philosophical question, like, ask, the other person what their thing is, and then, debate the sort of, or investigate the implications of their answer, and see if you can sort of get out all the way down underneath it, and in terms of its, whether it's going to hold up. And I mean, that makes it sound like a competitive project, but I could even like sort of conceptualize it cooperatively as like, you guys are on a team and you have to sell this to somebody else. And then maybe we have a second dialogue where, what they come up with, gets then presented to some other student, and, and then that other student has to see what they can do with it. And, and the goal is to, convince or something at that level, but then it's a team project. And so anything that doesn't, go as well, or any holes that are poked in the argument would then, at least it be a kind of collaborative, a shared kind of, well, this is what we came up together. Man, we missed that, but as opposed to like a me versus you thing. So that would be a way to make something like that collaborative as well. But I don't know, I haven't really worked it all out. It's just, we were just spitballing that day.
See, I'm gonna retweet something Reed said. Opportunities, like it's crisis, but it's opportunity, and I think it's a great example of a great opportunity for like a very, very fun assignment that again I would want to do.
Kelsey, just one side point. There's a lot of fascinating comments coming through the chat feed.
I know,
and I think are going to make some space to address some of those. The one that popped out at me was, are we going back to using blue books and pencils, or even worse, like keystroke capture on everything we're writing? I don't think that's the goal, but it is thinking about finding authentic ways for students to demonstrate their knowledge that might be useful beyond the disposable assignment, the assignment that goes only for the professor, their eyes only, and then it ends up in a trash can afterwards. Or are we asking them to engage in stuff that they can actually use in their portfolio or in their future career, college, etc.? We probably will see a lot of reactions to this, and I don't want to be too judgmental about any of them, but I'm just trying to stay positive on what are the ways that we can navigate this exciting moment where we get to rethink why we teach and how we learn.
I totally agree with that. And I would also add, as opposed to thinking of going back to blue books, you might also think of going forward to blue books, because there's different ways to do blue books as well. And, I have thought about giving this assignment that I told you about with the, tell me your opinion stuff, just in the first day of class, just hand out the blue books and go, okay, this is not going to be graded for content. But it is going to be graded on, diligence or effort, or, engagement, like taking it seriously or something. And then, they already walk out of my class with 100% in the class so far. And it's been the first day. We haven't even gone over the syllabus yet. And that actually might, in addition to solving some of these ChatGPT problems, be kind of cool. And either way, I'm going to be reading them. It doesn't matter whether I read them on the, the paper or on the electronic, medium instead. But I can also think of other things that I could do, with a kind of pen and paper kind of assignment that is different from just a traditional essay. And so if you do feel like you need to go back to blue books while you figure this out, especially if you're not as tech savvy as some of your colleagues, or if that scares you or something, or just sounds like too much work, you could go back to blue books. And if that does feel right for you, that doesn't mean you have to go back to it in the way that, you would have 10 years ago, or with the same old kinds of questions or something. You can think creatively about what could be done in a blue book with a different kind of assignment that's still pen and paper based. And I don't think there would be any problem with that at all.
And to piggyback off the litmus test question of, can you use writing at the start of it as a litmus test for what they're doing later? I know composition teachers in New York that are doing that, and it's an interesting idea. Of course, given even Grammarly, students can revise their writing so significantly that it may not look like the writing they're submitting on that blue book. So while we want to get to know them and use writing, the weird dimensions we have to figure out are, okay, well, how are we using this writing sample? Are we looking at cognition? Are we trying to look at things that, kinds of writing aids can support? And another point to keep in mind is just, do we have students who are we, like Bryan's doing low stakes at the beginning? It's not high stakes. They're all good 100%. If we start off with a high stakes piece, then do we automatically reproduce the sort of inequities around students who are better at high stakes writing in the classroom? It's all low stakes at the start. And I think that's an important point to remember.
Absolutely. I love low stakes assignments at the start of a term. And like we've done the way that Packback Questions is work, not to plug this, and I encourage it, whether you're using the Packback platform or not, is do you have regular at-bats for students to share their voice, to write, to interact with the course material that is low stakes, that is, let's say, encouraging them to explore on their own, but they're practicing writing, right? And I think that's so important. I love a low stakes assignment. If you know anything about me in my former teacher days, I like, fun little exit tickets that were 100% effort based. I liked the opportunity to grab a student and just ask them what they were thinking. But I think that's incredibly, if there's a takeaway I have today, it's, do you have a fun, low stakes writing assignment at the beginning of the term to allow students to develop their unique voice, right? And share that with you and feel encouraged to do so throughout. One question I saw in the chat quite often, so I want to address it, is the concept of like, are we going to be looking back at this day and age and like, feeling, oh, it was so silly to worry about GPT. Like this, grammar checkers came out, we tried to fight it, and then now it's just a part of writing. And I think that's a really valid point, is that we might 5-10 years from now say, I can't believe at one point we tried to ban GPT or, catch it. And that conversation is absolutely happening 6 days from now on how we use GPT as instructors in a way that is a superpower that is helping students in their writing process. But what I wanted to do today and what we will focus on is, at some point, students do need to share their unique voice, because that is the value of the assignment. And that is the objective of the assignment, is that's how they learn, and that's how they coexist with the material. So when students need to share their unique voice, they do not. How do we have those conversations? Because this is a terrifying new place to be. But again, we have to just, the best phrase I heard in teaching is great teachers borrow, best teachers steal, or something like that. So we're just going to steal from each other in this moment. So we're going to talk about facilitating student interventions. Let's say a detector says, hey, this was a incredibly high likelihood of AI submission, or your spidey senses are tingling because instead of problem of evil, somebody says trouble of evil or trouble of bad or something. And you're like, this isn't right. What I want to do is have a conversation around, how do you have conversations with students who clearly have utilized AI submitted text, or you believe a student has? And again, what I will say is that because AI generated text submission is not standard plagiarism, we don't have proof of this 9 times out of 10. It's a more nuanced conversation to have. It's more difficult. And the last thing I want is for educators who signed up to teach to find themselves in dicey scenarios, because ultimately all they care about is their students learning at the end of the day. So Bryan, I know you've facilitated some conversations thus far. Do you want to just chat a little bit about, how you facilitated those conversations, your strategy going into it, and then any advice you'd share with folks who need to have discussions with students?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing is just a kind of general form for this sort of thing anyway. I mean, I'm like, even if it were standard plagiarism, I mean, there's some overlap in these discussions, standard plagiarism and ChatGPT misuse. And one of those is that, I mean, there's kind of an inherent confrontation to it. And so the way I always approach it is, I tell them that ultimately I'm on their side, and that I'm looking at something where I don't have all the facts. I wasn't there when they wrote the paper, et cetera. And from the facts that I do have, the easiest story to tell is that they copy pasted this from a website and changed a few words or ran it through a Quillbot or whatever. And so that's the story I'm going with. And there are certain things that my university wants me to do when that's the story I have. And so I'll just tell them that if they've got information that can help me tell a story that is not that, then I'm all ears and I would be happy to tell that story. In other words, the best story that I've got is that they cheated or they plagiarized or whatever term you prefer. But if they've got information where all of a sudden that no longer becomes the easiest story to tell, but some other story becomes easier to tell that is in their favor, I'm happy to tell it. I'm with them. I can become their defender instead of their prosecutor. And so I kind of start there. But with regard to technology in particular, I think it really depends on the case. Yes, Occam's razor, that's right. I think it really depends on the case. If it's if they have used it in a way that like you can tell what they were trying to do and what they were trying to do was a good thing, then I would conduct that in a way that helps them see like a way to accomplish that more productive thing. In other words, if they kind of misfired at trying to use it well instead of misusing it, then it's a conversation about like how to use it better. But if I can tell that they misused it because they tried to misuse it, that's a different conversation. And depending on where I think their integrity and character and so on are at, and their level, like what emotions are happening, I will say that always, and I think Kelsey highlighted this is an important point, is I always do this sort of thing in person if I can. And I know that some of you probably teach exclusively online, and that might be tricky, but at least Zoom as opposed to, purely by email, like a lot of emotions play a big part in what I do, both mine and the students. If I can tell that they're scared, the other day I gave somebody a cup of tea, I just said, do you want a cup of tea? Sometimes little things like that. And I got that from my grad school professor who did it with a plagiarism case when I was a TA. Just little things like that. It just recognizing that they have emotions and also recognizing that I have them and paying attention to how those play into the thing and how they can educate me on what to do in a situation. That's all really important too. So that helps me read intent and a lot of other things.
Yeah, Reed, any thoughts on these conversations? I know definitely let's have them in person or over Zoom if possible, but any thoughts on these sorts of nuanced conversations with students?
Yeah, I just want to go back to my daughter always, who has the most interesting things to say for me. And she said that every one of her teachers has seen ChatGPT cheating at her school, but they're not calling out the student in front of their peers. And maybe that's obvious to us, but a lot of faculty or teachers may still be tempted to escalate the situation, to confront students in front of their peers, and basically alienate our students from learning or from coming back. I think we run the risk as educational institutions of reproducing the classroom as a courtroom, the classroom as a holding cell, the classroom as a confessional. We're not in that business. We're in the business of helping be a bridge for learning. And our work, I think, is to help do our due diligence to teach what we can call, some people call it a hidden curriculum. I like to think of it as academic cultural capital. What is okay in college? What is okay in high school? Sometimes they don't know what they're doing. And this is an opportunity, as Bryan said, to just talk about process. In a calm way, we get to learn about and kind of promote, even if we haven't so far, sort of a kind of transparency of what have you done so far in terms of research? Where have you looked? How much time have you been able to spend on it? and kind of unpack, okay, well, maybe they did some things that we can actually build upon, even though we're seeing these red flags that we don't know for sure. We can say, well, let's build upon the assets of what you did do correctly and give you an alternate learning activity that allows you to demonstrate and get a second chance, really. And again, it all depends on how transparent you are in your syllabus and what policies you've instituted. You do have to follow your policy within your college or institution, but there are ways to promote transparency, even in this moment, Bryan, where we can kind of like give them a chance to share what they've actually done authentically and support them. We're not trying to create gotcha experiences. That's just not the work of educators.
I love that so much. Just thinking about some, a framework going about this is, share observations without accusations. So I think, Bryan, the way you frame it to your students is like, this is the easiest story for me to tell in this moment. I want to hear your story. And I think saying like, these are the things I noticed and that alarmed me, and I want to hear from you what you're thinking. But I think, again, it's important to ask them about their process, because if they truly wrote this paper and it was just generally generic, they're still going to be able to speak to the process. And if they're struggling to speak to the process, they're probably going to end up, giving that away in some form. But I would say also, it's going to be interesting to be put in that position. You might have a student be honest with you and say, yeah, I used ChatGPT or Cactus for this whole paper or whatever program comes next, because one program will put up a paywall and a new free program will be born. I guarantee it's just going to be this never ending cycle. But, maybe give them the chance to resubmit and say, hey, this is what I'm going to be looking for in your next assignment. We need to be realistic. Not every student is going to admit that they, potentially misused AI. When students do, are we going to punish them for being honest, or are we going to maybe give them a second chance to succeed? And ultimately, I think, we have to be clear that it boils down to your institution's, guidelines and whatever your institution says you need to do. But at the end of the day, whenever I caught a student cheating, I always gave them one redo. Because guess what? I'm a professional and I've used ChatGPT a lot in the last few weeks. And I think we need to give students the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and also understand how to use this appropriately. And, learn that in that example, it's not appropriate to use ChatGPT for this assignment. When I'm trying to get to know you personally on a personal level, maybe in the future, we could talk about how you could use it for a future assignment more appropriately. So
Kelsey, I just want to build on the last comment you said, which was, as you're speaking, we had some comments come in. I think we have like 120 people in the room right now. And somebody said, I teach 700 students in a 7-week course. And I think the implication is, okay, well, how do we do alternate assessment or provide some solution for supersized classes? Our institution, we're pretty lucky, and we do have class size limits, so that we're able to do differentiating instruction for different students and provide, that kind of support that we're hoping for, which is one-to-one. But if you're in a scenario where you have an enormous class, I would still encourage you to think about the question of, okay, well, what might still be another way that they can demonstrate learning to have a second chance? It's such an important question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, those large courses, it's actually why Packback questions was developed, was because we wanted to scale a Socratic method in a large course room. But I think also one thing too is, asking yourselves, what do I need students to be doing in the moment? What am I trying to achieve with my course objectives? And maybe utilizing a really tough clicker question in class is going to be a great way for students to start critically thinking and have chances for these at-bats for learning. So there are so many different assignment types outside of, to your point, writing, where we can try to get students to engage with the course material regularly, practice their learning in a low stakes way, whether it is, maybe you are using an online discussion forum, or maybe it's an in-class assessment, a clicker question, or something that's low stakes or fun. I know, do you have any other thoughts on these large courses? Because that's the thought that comes into my brain is if, let's say I do have a writing assignment in a 700 student course, which I don't even know how you do that. But I certainly can't have conversations if 1 in every 10 students is using GPT, right? That I would spend 2 straight weeks having conversations. So any thoughts on, what you would be doing in a large lecture course. I don't know if we want to pause there and just ask for thoughts, Reed or Bryan.
I would advocate for a smaller class size.
I do have thoughts, but I probably have to roll them out in a more saintly way that would take some time. I wanted to ask you, Kelsey, there's a couple of questions in the actual Q&A that aren't the chat.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to address a couple of them quickly if we have time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It says, do you think institutions will be more open to students utilizing or restricting it? Some definitely are, and some definitely aren't. There's been ones that have made the headlines that have said, okay, blue books for everything. And then there are other ones that are adopting more of the kind of approach that we're advocating here, which is more like find a way to use it and find a way to keep it from getting in your way. And then there are lots of institutions like mine that are kind of staying agnostic about it and letting teachers just make the decision themselves, which is actually frustrating because then you don't know whether to turn in a plagiarism case or not. But I think the sort of the second question from that same person says, would it be considered cheating or plagiarism to use it? And I think that really depends on how you construct the assignment. Then the second question here says, I realize that the difference between more traditional class, English Lit, how it can affect those type of classes, but does AI have the ability to write more specific technical based information, medicine or research based paper? The answer is yes. There have been a lot of things in the news about it being able to pass the bar in medical MCAT, essays. And even if it couldn't now, and it already can, but even if it couldn't now, it's getting better. And of course, there will be, Microsoft just dumped, millions into making this better than it already is. So it's going to get better. So there's no way to hide and be like, well, it doesn't understand my field. If it doesn't already, it will.
Absolutely. And Reed, you did a really fascinating webinar to faculty where you actually showed STEM courses how ChatGPT would perform on a lab write-up, correct?
That's correct.
And it was good.
I'm going to do a sort of a demo on that at ITC coming up next week, but it was really helpful for us because we wanted to get a finger on the pulse of our faculty in terms of who's using it and do they think their students are using it. And then we walk through all the common questions that our science, or many common questions that our science faculty ask in their courses and how those tools can be used. More recently, I had a meeting with our online department heads where we just had the tool give sample syllabus statements you can create and add to your syllabus. Engaging our faculty in how to use this tool is so important. And for teacher education folks in K-12, I think engaging the K-12 teachers in the same question, like we're doing right now, what would you do in this scenario? And letting them go into small groups and consider what they would do in their classrooms is so important because until you practice doing it, I don't think it becomes very real.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like
but again, oh, sorry, go ahead, Bryan.
I know, finish. Yeah, so I just want to piggyback on your faculty use comment. But
yeah, please do.
I hesitated even to say this, but the mischievous part of me just cannot avoid it.
That's why we have you here.
I actually asked ChatGPT what grade in a college class it would give one of my several of my student papers, and I copy pasted the text in and said, what grade would I earn on this in a college class? And the grade it gave was probably about what I would have given it. And on top of that, and I didn't even ask for this, it actually gave all the reasons for the grade that it gave, and they were about right. So, this isn't just students. I'm not telling you not to grade your own papers, but
well, I mean, we have to think
of a fun conversation to have with students, like reminding them, hey, that's
partially the point that we're trying to make, is that these are labor-saving devices that our students are going to be expected to use them in the workplace. And so it's our responsibility to help students know how to use them responsibly for their future. And our faculty, our department heads can use them to update policy, to create bios of faculty on their team, to create syllabus statements. So even if you're concerned about the tool, I would recommend starting to play and getting informed about this tool, because you can't really navigate it unless you've been playing with it yourself and figuring out how it works. Somebody mentioned the chat feed. Can we do role playing and create discussions? You could use this tool to create fake discussions between two different people. You can have it right at the level of a 10th grader without even using Quillbot. You can just have it spin and spin and spin language, and it will make mistakes. But I would encourage you to start playing with the tool today in proactive ways, realizing that this is part of our future. As we know from the big news with Google Bard yesterday, and from Microsoft bringing it into their Bing system as of yesterday, everything is changing quickly. And it's our responsibility to really, I think, engage with these new technologies so we can empower our students to know how to use them in the future.
And it's also massively fun.
It is. It's like hilariously fun.
It is. It is. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit about updating syllabus statements, but I do think that a lot of the comment section has again talked about, like, how do we actually get our students using this? Because I do think when I think about the assignments I wouldn't give my students, all right, 50%, I just really don't want the student using GPT because I want to hear their own voice. I want to hear their unique experiences. I want that to be authentic, but maybe 50% of assignments, they should be using GPT because they need to learn how to evolve alongside with it. I need to learn how to evolve alongside it. They also need to start learning how to do things like verifying claims and culling and editing and making more concise arguments. You know, I was in STEM, so concise writing was the key. So if you are interested in that, we are doing another webinar a week from, or 6 days from today, where we are going to talk about how to use ChatGPT as a superpower, teach with it. But one thing I did want to make sure we showed and had a brief conversation on, might go a little bit over. Reed and Bryan, is that okay if I take another 10, 15 minutes of your time? Okay, I figured, I'm having fun. But is amending syllabi. So, you know, a lot of our dialogue so far has been what happens when your students utilize AI text detection? Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, what guidelines did we set at the beginning of the term and throughout the assignment that actually made it clear what appropriate use of tools looked like? So I think we need to ask ourselves, is our syllabus language specifically talking about generative AI? Is it giving recommendations or guidelines of how to appropriately utilize AI, and then how to properly disclose the use of generative AI? So again, I think it very much depends on your writing assignments. It depends on your course. It depends on the objective and the expectation of the assignment. But I think this is really important for us to ask ourselves about the assignment. And here's an example of an AI policy that I saw on Twitter that went pretty viral on how we can amend our syllabi if we do expect students to use GPT, which, by the way, they absolutely are using GPT. So let's just teach them how to use it wisely. But one piece of feedback I got from an instructor was, I don't have time to go back and change my syllabus. It's already submitted, and I technically can't amend it because I can't do that once the term starts. So it might be too late to amend syllabi or drastically change assignments. What small steps can instructors take to a day to avoid academic misconduct? So I don't know if Reed or Bryan, you have any thoughts on this, of what are small tweaks I can make in an assignment that might be coming up, or my, you know, I can't change my syllabus, but how can I communicate expectations and guidelines, you know, a month into the term?
So I have one piece, which is just going back to my process or transparency note, that if you include self-annotation, this isn't even an engineering design process, on what was your process, what did you choose to optimize, and why, in their own words. Yeah, they may use the tool to hack the formality of the language, but our goal is cognition. The goal of writing isn't writing to assess or writing to learn. We're trying to learn. And if our goal is to support learning, then those kinds of processes can help them demonstrate their learning, and can also help students who do not speak the language of power show their knowledge without feeling anxious that they're going to be judged for not knowing the proper grammar, et cetera, the norms of language. I think you think of the word processor. I think of this as a knowledge processor. It's just helping us process our ideas. But on the side, we have to be able to explain our own thought processes as we're doing the research. And for anything that students are submitting, I pull back to the idea of let students tell the story of their process. And whether that's on audio, whether that's as text, whether that's as video, whether that's in person, that may help. Bryan, what comes to your mind in terms of short, quick ways besides a self-annotation to help adjust assignments?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing that I considered doing, and this goes back to the one participant's comment about blue books, is I thought about, changing a paper to a sort of in-class essay exam, and then taking the exam that I was going to put there that was a more multiple choice thing, and just moving that to like a final quiz or final test or something like that. So I think, and those kinds of moves, I asked my boss about, and to find out if I could make those kinds of moves as just a fast triage way to solve the problem. Now I told him, I said, listen, this summer I'm going to sit down and really think hard about this and figure out what kind of assignments I want to do in the future and so on. And I said, but for now, can I just move a few things around? And sometimes just moving something to a little bit of an in-class thing can work. Also, if I don't know how you do this sort of thing for your students, but I often have okay, here's the assignment, here's when it's due, and then I'll have see this guideline in the Canvas folder for handouts or whatever as to the deeper instructions. And if it's, 4 weeks before they're even going to do the assignment, I'll just say, hey, everybody, I always tell people to look at the most up-to-date version of everything anyway, whatever's online, don't download it and then use that for the whole semester. Because if I got a date wrong or something, then I'm going to change it and you're going to need to know that. So I always warn people about that anyway. But, most people are not writing their assignments now. They haven't even looked at the instructions. So if I just, make that unpublished or whatever, and then I go in and I tweak a few things here and there that will just, even just the clause, some little paragraph saying, please don't use ChatGPT if that's what you want. I mean, I know that's not the theme of this, but if that's the way you're feeling about it and you're just trying to get through the semester, just put a little thing and say, please don't use it. I do spend some time paying attention to that. And that may dissuade at least a couple, so just really anything you can do that just staves it off a little bit, little tweaks here and there, include more.
Can I throw a crazy idea, Brian, at you?
Yeah.
It would be to drop your assignment idea into ChatGPT and see what it recommends as an alternate activity when you revise it. You say, please revise this activity with ChatGPT in mind.
Exactly.
And see what it says.
Yeah,
I'm kind of curious.
You're picking up on my thing that we keep acting I hate the hate's a strong word. I think I mean hate. I hate the attitude that presupposes this whole conversation is this is their tool. It's a democratic thing. It's out there. Everybody uses it. We can use it too. It's not we're pure and not going to use it. That we don't have any uses for it. It's not theirs. They don't own it. We can use it for things like what you just said, Reed.
Absolutely.
And,
yeah,
and it may give terrible answers, just as a caveat, but it might, if you give it a specific question, how can you change this to a more of a project-based learning assignment that authentically shows student knowledge and connects their lives to the learning, and ask it for 3 sample revisions. And then you go through and you say, well, I like the first part of this assignment, the second part of this description, and the third part of this description. Then you have to do the work of combining those ideas together. It'll give you some terrible ideas and some great ideas, but at least it'll give you it'll aid in your thinking process. For me, if I'm stuck, I can ask it to brainstorm for me, and it gives me a list of 5 items. And I'm like, oh, I like 3 of those. I'm going to build on those. It may actually help you with answering this weird question.
Yeah, absolutely. Our director of sales, actually, he teaches every Monday, and he needed an accommodation for a student. And so he put his lesson plan in a ChatGPT and said, how can I accommodate for for the student? And it gave a really good answer. So again, it's I've used it to help me write more concisely. I know that an instructor, Jadrian, who was at our last webinar, said that he uses it to help soften up his emails because he tends to need that. But yeah, for some ideas to this question too, because I think a lot of times folks are just, nervous about making the change halfway through the semester or at the beginning of the semester because we have so much on our plates. But I think if you can amend your syllabus, because sometimes you have to turn it in and it can't change after the start of the term. I've heard of that at institutions. Maybe an LMS announcement or a short 10-minute segment in class is an appropriate time to maybe communicate guidelines around generative AI. If you can't amend the assignment, Bryan, to your point, like maybe I need these 5 assignments at 10% each, and that can't change. But maybe instead of asking students to do 2-page summary of an article that they need to read, maybe I change it. Hey, it's 2 pages and it's still this article, but instead of summarizing it, I want you to do XYZ, like write a critique of the article in a certain voice, right? So maybe making it just a little bit different, or like, what's the one thing in the article that you just did not understand? And if you had to guess what it meant, what would you guess? Just changing the assignment so that it's honestly maybe a little bit more fun for the student to do. And I would say probably arguably more fun for you to grade and read 50 of them, right? 100 of them, 180 of them. And then to Bryan, I think your point, sharing the purpose of the assignment, every assignment transparently, it's going to feel really unnatural to do probably, especially if you're teaching higher education pretty high up. But why do they need to write that summary? Is it because you want to check that they've read the text? Or is it because you want to have a really robust discussion in class, and that's not going to happen unless they've all read the text? Very different purposes.
And Kelsey, I would add on to your comment here, which is that there's a lot of emerging ed tech that can be used to sort of address this. And I know you haven't, this is not a promo for Packback, but maybe you might share like one way that Packback actually helps address this kind of need. Does anything come to mind in a sentence or two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we're thinking about why Packback Questions was created, it was because we wanted students to talk about what they cared about in a safe space. We wanted them to have authentic discussion at scale, right? Because I would argue any course size over 25, it just gets hard to have a true authentic discussion. And you have some students who just quite frankly feel uncomfortable speaking up. So Packback Questions, I would say, is an amazing assignment for getting students excited about writing about the subject matter, because they get to choose what they want to write about. They're asking their own questions. And I've seen a lot of writing about ChatGPT where, okay, in a world where every answer is accessible, maybe what matters more is the question. And Packback Questions is all about students asking their own question.
Interesting. That's such a great statement.
Mm-hmm.
What matters more is the question. I do think that's true with our use of ChatGPT, like regardless of Packback, but
Yep.
it's how we ask the question and how capably we're able to ask intelligent, nuanced questions. That's going to be, to me, that's the game changer for AI, is how do we pose questions? But that also comes back to, I think, what we're trying to support. Bryan's doing it with his Socratic method, I'm sure, with teaching philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I just answered a question on online here that might be important. They're wanting to know if like they can't get in because it's at capacity. Is there a subscription? There is a subscription. I told this person to keep trying, they'll get in eventually, but there is going to be a subscription they've announced that gives up VIP access where you get in before all the other people who are waiting if you pay $20 a month or whatever it is. And that is actually one reason why assigning the use of ChatGPT for your students might end up being problematic, because there's going to be all kinds of access issues about who can afford to have the premium membership. And as you know, students, like most of us, procrastinate until the last minute. And if they're all procrastinating to the last minute, getting in is going to be hard. You're going to get lots of emails that say, I couldn't get into ChatGPT. And if you want to deal with that headache, then then it's okay. But those kinds of headaches will come for assignments that require the use of ChatGPT.
The second piece is that it requires telephone numbers too, Bryan.
Oh, really?
And when you create an account, you have to share your phone number.
I know.
And so like those are issues that, to me, I want my students to play with a tool, but I always have to give them choice. If I want them to play with AI, that's an option, but it's not a requirement, because, we'll see what happens with Bing though. Bing may change in such a way that there isn't those barriers. We'll see what happens with Bard when that rolls out.
Yeah.
Hard to know, but I just wanted to mention it because there are a lot of people kind of in the chat that are more or less advocating for what we're advocating for, accept it. But there's a strong version of accept it and a weak version of accept it. And the strong version is like accept it in such a way that you actually require people to do it for their assignments. There's somebody at Penn doing that.
Mhm.
But the problem with that is that everybody has to be able to get in, and everybody,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? And they have to want to give their phone number and all of that. So that's a lot to think about.
If you do that, you want to try to be transparent in your course description or what you're doing at the start of the semester. Some classes, for example, require students to use video
Yeah.
for video-based learning. Whatever the expectation is, I think you just have to be clear. I love the idea of requiring its use, but I would have to be transparent at the very front of the class to say, okay, expect that we're going to be using AI to understand AI. But that would be a whole different class model. For what I'm doing right now, they're probably not going to be using AI because they're doing creative nonfiction. That's the class that's up next for me. But I would say for other classes, yeah, I want them to have choice, always have student choice on how they can learn and demonstrate their knowledge.
Also depends on whether it's a required course for like their major or even general education. And
True.
if they have to take, like there are some classes I teach where there's a major that all of them have to take that class and there's nobody else that teaches it. And if I make them use it, that means they can't graduate unless they do what I ask them to do.
Mhm.
So every decision I make about those kinds of assignments and so on is I'm always thinking, okay, who can't do this, you know? So it's, every situation is going to be individual, but I just wanted to raise the idea that it's not as simple as, just require the usage of it, like the Penn professor said, because there are going to be people who can't use it, and then you're placing a barrier between them and success. And that's the total opposite of what I think most of us, or at least, make as our number one priority. On the other things you can do with your assignment, you can ask for sources. You can ask that they be the sources from the class so that they don't even have to look it up. Now, I've done a little bit of that. ChatGPT can sometimes do some of that, so that's not foolproof. One I really like is saying incorporate things that happened in class. That also helps your attendance. So that's another good thing. Incorporate class discussions or things that other students said in class, while you're, in your paper. And so that's going to be very hard for ChatGPT to hack. And I dare say that if ChatGPT figures out how to do that, we have much bigger problems than ChatGPT, or at least cheating.
I love the idea of referencing something from class as a way to encourage people to attend a live class. That's brilliant.
Yeah. And it also like opens the door for us to be making our lectures like quirkier and more original, and probably like a lot more discussion based, which Bryan, I'm sure your courses are for sure, your lectures. But again, like I maybe it's the just blind optimist in me, which I've been told before that I can be a little bit Leslie Knope when I need to maybe be a little bit more Ron Swanson, if you understand the reference. Right. But I do keep thinking about like, what are all of the different changes that we'll be making to our lectures, to our assessments, to our assignment types, because everybody's on board with the fact that assessments need to be authentic and they need to serve a true purpose. And we need to give our students additional learning opportunities and assessment opportunities. So again, I'll put my, optimism blinders on and say, I'm excited for the future. And of course, we have like wonderful people like you two who will help navigate us through the bumps that always end up happening, right?
And everyone in the chat feed, like you just mentioned authentic assignments, and I was seeing service learning components, which nobody seems to do in higher ed, but we can think about how do we connect the classroom to the community. And I would encourage you all to go back to your other teachers at your institution and start thinking about authentic assessments long-term. I mean, short-term changes matter, but also thinking about, okay, well, how could we breathe new life into these assignments? It's an opportunity that we get to rethink things. And that's kind of, for me, that's exciting.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've had a thorough Q&A. So what I will do is wrap up by saying, if you are curious to learn more about Packback and what Packback does as more of an instructional AI, we've always used AI to bring instructor and student closer together, not necessarily generate content for student. We don't do that at all. We help students generate the content. Email curious@packback.co. Thank you, Bryan and Reed, so much for this conversation. It was amazing. This is probably the liveliest chat we've had thus far. I had no doubts that was going to happen. Any final sign-offs, Bryan or Reed, as instructors are, getting into the heat of their spring term and just trying to maybe survive?
I have one that I will parrot from you, which is you wanted us to remind them that you are not alone. So that's my recommendation for you is to remember you're not alone here. We're all together in this.
Yeah, Brian, any last thoughts? Final thoughts sounded so dreary.
Make yourself a cup of tea.
I love that. I love that. Deep breath in, make yourself a cup of tea. You were not alone. That's the summary. Well, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Reed and Brian, so much for the conversation. It was amazing. And I know I saw some amazing names. Leslie Hendon, who's been using Packback before it really was even a product and it was more just an idea. Great to see some names out there. Carmen, I've heard so much about you, so I'm excited to follow up as well. And have a wonderful week, everyone. Thanks so much.